There were just 65 seconds remaining on the clock. Millions of Americans were watching two of the AFL's best teams in a high-scoring, back-and-forth thriller. The New York Jets had just taken the lead, and the Oakland Raiders were about to get the ball back. Viewers across the country were glued to their television sets, anticipating an unforgettable finish. Instead, NBC cut away to a made-for-TV film called Heidi. What transpired over that final minute changed sport television forever. For decades, the Heidi Game, also known as the Heidi Bowl, has been remembered as the night NBC chose a children's movie over football. But that's only part of the story. The truth is, NBC's leadership had already decided to stay with the game until it was over, but their orders never reached the master control room in New York. So how did the oldest major broadcasting network in the U.S. end up doing the exact opposite of what its own president had ordered? In today's modern era of broadcasting, if a football game runs long, the solution seems obvious. Leave the game on, delay the next program, or move it to another channel. So why didn't NBC simply do that on this November evening in 1968? Because television didn't work that way. In the late 60s, there were only 3 television networks, and each one operated a single national feed distributed through AT&T's long-distance transmission network. There were no cable channels to move a game to, no streaming services, and no backup network waiting in the wings. If NBC wanted to change what millions of Americans were watching, it couldn't simply push a button. It required a carefully coordinated series of manual switching operations. But the technology was only part of the problem. Television at the time revolved around rigid schedules. Sponsors paid months in advance for commercials to air at precise times, and viewers expected their favorite programs to begin exactly when they appeared in their TV guide. If a program was scheduled to begin at 7, it began at 7. Rarely were exceptions made. Live sports weren't expected to dictate the schedule. The schedule dictated the sports broadcast. If a football or baseball game happened to run long, standard practice was to simply end the telecast and begin the next scheduled program. For NBC, that next program wasn't just another television show. It was Heidi. The network had spent months building toward its debut. Watchmaker Timex had reportedly paid an eye-popping $700,000 to be the exclusive sponsor of the entire 2-hour broadcast, and everything about the evening had been planned around the movie beginning at exactly 7 p.m. As far as NBC was concerned, there was no reason to think the evening wouldn't unfold exactly as planned. Most professional football games at the time ran just under 2.5 hours, leaving plenty of room inside a 3-hour broadcast window. The game was supposed to end on time, deliver a massive audience as a lead-in to Heidi, and quietly get out of the way. Instead, it refused to cooperate. As the afternoon of November 17 inched toward 7 p.m., the clock inside the Oakland Coliseum and the clock inside NBC headquarters were counting down to 2 very different deadlines. Virtually from the opening kickoff, NBC's carefully planned schedule was in jeopardy. Both offenses relied heavily on the passing game, and every incompletion stopped the game clock while the real clock continued to tick away. Multiple injuries and more than 200 yards in penalties only pushed the telecast farther and farther behind schedule. Every dramatic drive meant precious minutes slipping away, and with each passing possession, it became increasingly clear that the game wasn't going to be over before Heidi was supposed to begin. That realization placed the network in an impossible position. If NBC stayed with the football game, it would have to delay one of the most heavily promoted television movies of the year, and risk angering its sponsor. But if it left the game, millions of football fans would miss the ending of one of the season's biggest matchups. As 7 o'clock drew closer, there didn't seem to be a good solution. The network simply had to choose which audience it was willing to disappoint. But just when the situation appeared hopeless, NBC President Julian Goodman made a decision that should have solved the entire problem. Instead, it triggered a chain of events that no one inside the network saw coming. To understand how NBC found itself at the center of one of the biggest blunders in broadcasting history, we have to look at the chain of command inside the network that evening. Goodman was the only person at the network that could authorize keeping the game on the air. Watching from his New York home, it was clear by 6:30 that the game was almost certainly going to run past 7 o'clock. More importantly, he could see that this wasn't just another football game. It was turning into an instant classic. So the 46-year-old executive made a decision that was extremely rare at the time. Instead of doing what television networks had always done, he decided NBC would stay with the football game until it was over. The problem was, Curt Gowdy had already informed viewers that Heidi would begin promptly at 7 p.m. in the Eastern and Central time zones, while the game would remain on the air for much of the West. On paper, communicating that scheduling change should have been straightforward. Goodman immediately telephoned Don Meany, NBC's vice president of sports, who was also watching the broadcast. Meany's job was to relay the president's decision to Master Control in New York, the room responsible for switching the entire national network from one program to the next. Had that message arrived, the story of the Heidi Game might have ended right there. But while Meany was trying to deliver that order, something completely unexpected was happening. Across the country, football fans had also realized the game was never going to end by 7 o'clock. Worried that NBC would leave the broadcast before the finish, they did exactly what people did in 1968 when they wanted to make their voices heard. They went straight to Facebook and Twitter. Sorry, kids. This was decades before social media, and even cell phones for that matter. Instead, they picked up the telephone. Within minutes, NBC's switchboard was flooded with calls. Thousands were calling in to insist that Heidi begin as scheduled, and an equal number demanded that the network stay with the game. Ironically, the same people trying to prevent the disaster were about to make it unavoidable. When Meany tried to telephone Dick Klein at Master Control with the president's order, he couldn't get through. He tried again and again. Each time he was met with the same busy signal. Inside Master Control, no one had any idea that the president of NBC had already changed the plan. Klein waited and waited for a decision to switch from the game to the movie. But when he heard nothing, his only choice was to proceed with the instructions he received earlier in the week. As the final minute slipped away, the countdown began. At precisely 7 p.m. Eastern, NBC left the game. First came a commercial break, followed by station identification, and then Heidi. Across the eastern half of the country, millions of viewers suddenly found themselves looking at the Swiss Alps instead of the Oakland Coliseum. One moment they were watching one of the best football games of the season, the next, a little girl with braids walking through the mountains. Most people assumed the game had simply ended, but it was far from over. Back in Oakland, the Raiders took over at their own 23-yard line with just over a minute remaining, trailing 32-29. Quarterback Darryl LaMonica quickly connected with Charlie Smith for a 43-yard touchdown to give the Raiders a 4-point lead with 42 seconds left on the game clock. There was still time for New York to rally. But on the ensuing kickoff, Jets return man Earl Christie fumbled the ball near his own goal line, and the Raiders recovered it in the end zone for another touchdown. 2 touchdowns, 9 seconds. The Raiders had turned a 3-point deficit into a 43-32 victory in one of the most astonishing finishes professional football had ever seen. And 80% of the country missed it. Eventually, Goodman finally got through to Dick Klein and Master Control. "Go back to the game," he told him. But it was already too late. Klein said he would try, yet there was simply no way to physically do it. Meanwhile, viewers flooded NBC with phone calls, furious that the network had abandoned the game just before its conclusion. The volume of calls overwhelmed the network switchboard, blowing fuses and making it nearly impossible for anyone to get through. More than an hour after the game ended, NBC tried to calm the outrage by running crawls across the bottom of the screen announcing that Oakland had won the game 43-32. Instead, it only made things worse. Unable to reach NBC, many began calling the New York Telephone Company, the New York Times, and even the NYPD, tying up emergency phone lines for hours. At 8:30 p.m., Julian Goodman issued a public apology. It was a forgivable error committed by humans who were concerned about the children who were expecting to see Heidi. I missed the end of the game as much as anyone else. By the end of the night, what had begun as a routine programming decision had become one of the biggest public relations disasters in television history. The following morning, it was front-page news across America. Newspapers from coast to coast led with the story. The New York Times devoted front-page coverage to both the Raiders' stunning comeback and NBC's decision to cut away from the game, while columnists, cartoonists, and late-night comedians had a field day at the network's expense. But inside NBC, the mood was very different. The next day, Dick Klein, the supervisor who had actually switched the network to Heidi, was called in to an executive meeting. Rather than blaming him, NBC officials told him he had done exactly what he had been instructed to do. Had he ignored the standing plan and stayed with the game without authorization, he likely would have been fired. That single conversation perfectly captured what had really happened. The Heidi Game wasn't a story of one careless employee making a bad decision. It was a story of an entire broadcasting system that had been designed for a different era, one where television schedules were expected to control live events instead of the other way around. The public backlash made it crystal clear that viewers no longer saw live sports as just another television program. They saw it as an event that had to be experienced in real time, from the opening kickoff to the final whistle. In the aftermath, new language was added to television contracts requiring games to be carried to their conclusion in their home markets. NBC made changes as well. The network installed what became known as the Heidi phone, a dedicated line connecting executives directly with master control so critical instructions could never again be blocked by an overloaded switchboard. Today, when a football game runs long, broadcasters don't apologize for delaying the next program. Instead, they tell viewers they'll stay with the game until its conclusion. Most of us never think twice about hearing those words, but they exist because of one extraordinary Sunday evening in November 1968, when 65 unforgettable seconds exposed the limits of an entire television industry and forced it to change.